Thank you very much. So this is going to be a bit different in various ways from yesterday. I'm going to talk about the function of consciousness. I'm going to begin by giving some extended introductory remarks. I guess to some extent I did that also yesterday with a number of introductory remarks. But the view that I'm going to be defending in this talk, almost nobody likes it. So the introductory remarks are much more important this time to make sure that people know what I am saying, what I'm not saying, and to set aside various kinds of confusions. Then I'm going to talk about the function that's claimed for the consciousness of rational thought in section 2, and then the function that's claimed for the consciousness of intentional action in section 3, and if we have time, well, I've got to do some section 4. I'll do some of section 4, which has to do with executive control, and it's only really in section 4 that I'll mention my own theory, but the higher order thought theory that I was defending yesterday, and then really only by indirection. Okay, so, introduction and caveats. It's often held that conscious states, unlike mental states that are not conscious, have some special tie to rationality or to intentional action or executive function. So it may be, it's sometimes claimed that it may be that a mental state's being conscious actually enhances rationality, makes it better, or that it enhances intentional action in some way, or that it enhances executive control. And it may even be, some people believe, that the consciousness of mental states doesn't simply enhance these three things, but it makes them possible in the first place. And if something along those lines is true, then these functions might help to explain why creatures like ourselves evolved to have mental states that are sometimes, and in our own case certainly, often conscious. And by function here, sometimes I'll talk about utility, sometimes I'll talk about benefit. I don't mean anything by function here except something that's good for the functioning of the organism. So it might be the kind of thing that's good for the functioning of the organism from the point of view of adaptive selection pressures, the sort of thing that evolutionary processes are claimed to like, but it might be something that's good for the organism in some other way to which evolution might be blind. So I'm going to raise doubts about all these ties that are claimed for the consciousness of mental states. And I'm going to argue, indeed, that there is very little function, very little utility to a mental state's being conscious. And if that's true, then we have, of course, to explain the occurrence of the consciousness of mental states, not by appeal to its being beneficial for mental states to be conscious, but in some other way. And I'm going to rely on three kinds of considerations in this talk. I'm going to rely on common sense, everyday, folk psychological observations, and I'm going to rely on some very broad theoretical considerations, and I'm going to rely on some experimental findings. So, a bunch of caveats. A first caveat is that having little or no function does not mean having no causal efficacy. Presumably nothing that exists in the universe lacks causal efficacy altogether. Everything causes something. But not everything that exists in the universe is good for anything. And what I'm claiming is that the consciousness of mental states is such a thing. It's not very much good for anything, maybe not good at all, but that doesn't mean it has no causal efficacy. So the view that I'm developing here does not imply or even suggest the view sometimes discussed by people in philosophy and championed by Thomas Huxley in the 19th century, known as epiphenomenalism. A second preliminary. I'm going to be concerned only with the function of mental states being conscious. So here, let me refer back to yesterday when I distinguished at the very outset between three kinds of ways that we use the word conscious: creature consciousness, transitive consciousness, and state consciousness. Today I'm just going to be talking about the function of state consciousness. And I'm going to be concerned, so you have a mental state, and maybe it has some function. Now, let's suppose that the mental state comes to be conscious. What function does that add to the function that the state already had? Right? So conscious states are going to have plenty of function, but they're going to have function not in virtue of being conscious, according to me, but in virtue of other mental properties. My concern, therefore, is not going to be with the function of an individual's being conscious, nor with the function of an individual's being conscious of something, not creature consciousness, not transitive consciousness. These are plainly distinct properties, and you can tell that they're plainly distinct properties because the contrary predicates, unconscious or not conscious, have different application conditions in all three cases. You might be tempted to run these three properties together, but when you consider the contraries, that will undermine whatever temptation there is to run the three of them together. Now, plainly, an individual's being conscious is crucial for its functioning and survival. If you had an animal that slept all day and never was awake, never was conscious, bad for the animal. And an animal's being in various mental states, in virtue of which the animal is conscious of things, is also crucial to successful functioning. And these benefits are sometimes seen as due to mental states being conscious. I don't know that that's exactly true. I think a more refined version of that last bullet point might be that what happens in the literature, for example, with this wonderful psychologist who's written about the function of consciousness, he talks about the function of mental states being conscious, but he runs it together with transitive consciousness. So the actual function that he comes up with has to do with the way in which mental states represent things, not the fact that the mental states are conscious. But what I want to do here is draw a very sharp distinction between these two kinds of consciousness. The benefits of individuals being conscious, awake, and of individuals being conscious of things do not automatically carry over, therefore, to the benefit that mental states might have in being conscious states. And that last thing is my focus here, whether there is any benefit at all for mental states being conscious. Okay, a third preliminary. I'm going to be concerned here only with one special case of conscious states. Yesterday I was talking about qualitative states mostly, though I was talking about both kinds, intentional states and qualitative states. Today I'm going to be talking only about intentional states. It's a big job to argue that mental states have no function. Actually, it would be a big job if you thought they had a function to argue that they have a function. So I think a divide and conquer strategy here is crucial to talk about intentional states on the one hand and qualitative states on the other hand. And the states that I outlined here, the states that figure in rationality and that figure in intentional action, and the states that figure in so-called executive control, these are all intentional states. For all I have to say today, it might be that there is some function for sensations and perceptions being conscious. As it happens, I've argued elsewhere that there isn't. But that's an equally long story, so it's probably better just to stick to the limitation to intentional states today. Yes, that's a topic for another occasion. A fourth preliminary about how my argument today relates to my higher-order thought theory of consciousness. I actually first got interested in the function of consciousness when Fred Dresky criticized my view in print some years ago, because according to Dresky, there is no function for a mental state's being conscious, according to my view. And at first, you know, somebody says you're wrong because of something. So you say, no, I'm right, and you come up with something very quick. And what I came up with very quick was, well, maybe there's a little bit of function. So that's not nothing. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, actually there might be a little bit, but there isn't going to be any more, right? What does Dresky think the function of consciousness is anyway? So then I started thinking more and more about that. I'm going to mention my theory not in part 3. That's just untrue. That's a previous version of these slides. In part 4. But my argument that consciousness has no significant function, that is to say, my talk today, in no way relies on my higher-order thought theory. It's completely independent. On the other hand, there is an interesting connection, which is, given that I think Dresky is right, that on higher-order thought theory, a mental state's being conscious has very little function. If I can argue independently that it actually has very little function, that's a good thing for my theory. Indirectly good, but still good. I like that. A few final preliminaries. Consciousness might seem to have some function because of its being so subjectively central in our lives. Right? I think that's one of the intuitive ideas that people have when they say, you must be a completely crazy person to be denying that consciousness has a function, which is a reaction that I sometimes get. But subjective centrality has nothing to do with function. You can be subjectively central. I mean, notice, it's subjectively central. It's central so far as the appearances of our mental lives are concerned, not central in some serious way, as we might put it. Positing a function is also perhaps inviting to many people because we understand things, and I think that this is true. We do understand things only insofar as we can locate those things within an explanatory nexus, within an explanatory net. And it may seem, how can you locate the consciousness of mental states within an explanatory nexus unless you do it in virtue of the function that consciousness has? And I notice a couple of people nodding. That's a powerful idea. I don't think it's that powerful an idea, actually. I think it's a powerful idea only in a kind of an illusory way. Because, look, one way to explain something might be you discover what it's good for, like pumping blood. If you discovered something was good for pumping blood, that would be part of understanding the heart. But a much more direct way of understanding the consciousness of mental states would be simply to discover what causes it. What gives rise to it causally. And if you discover what gives rise to it causally, then function, no function, lots of function, bad function, then it wouldn't matter at all. So what I've said in the last bullet point here is that the appeal, among psychologists and neuropsychologists to function, I think, is a kind of a black box method. That is to say, we don't know how to get in there in a good way yet and figure out what's really going on causally, where the consciousness of mental states lies in a causal nexus. So we try to do it looking just from the outside in a black box way, right? But you know, maybe that's a good method with some things. What I'm going to argue is it's going to turn out not to be a good method with the consciousness of mental states. And it's perfectly plain that whether you can do that effectively with any particular phenomenon is going to depend on how things are wired, right? It's not going to, you can't count on that being a successful method. The appeal to explanation is, of course, this is something that serious people like psychologists don't really worry about so much, if at all, but people in philosophy do. I think people in philosophy very often want to sustain, or perhaps to attack, naturalism. I myself want to try to sustain naturalism, and I think most people in philosophy these days probably have that attitude. And if you can't explain something, then you're not going to be able to explain naturalism with respect to that thing, right? And so in this particular case, we want to be able to explain what it is for mental states to be conscious in order to sustain naturalism with respect to the consciousness of mental states, right? And when something seems to be in other ways intractable to naturalization, when we can't figure out sort of directly how to naturalize it, how to locate it in the natural world, then a natural thing to do since 1859 with the publication of The Origin of Species is to invoke a Darwinian causal story. I say causal story deliberately because I think most of the time it's just a story. It's not really an explanation. It's a kind of a line of pattern. But a Darwinian causal story of the origin of that phenomenon, and if you have a Darwinian causal story about how the thing at least could have arisen, then you're at least, you have something to say against the idea that the phenomenon cannot be naturalized. So that's a kind of motivation for the appeal to evolution. But I think it's not very often noticed. And in the United States, with people arguing for bizarre Christian reasons that evolution isn't true, this has become sort of, if you say things like what I'm saying here, namely, you cast doubt on evolution being the universal solvent for all problems, then people automatically in the U.S. get somewhat upset. But it is true that exclusively selectionist stories are very dubious. For one thing, the genetic material doubtless has, because of its chemical makeup, a preference for mutating in certain ways as against others. So that's one reason that evolution goes the way it does. That has nothing to do with selection pressures at all. And as we know, in addition, a lot of non-adaptive traits, a lot of traits that have no adaptive value, arise in various ways by accident. They arise by accident because a trait is selected for, and that means this genetic material and this genetic material combined with that genetic material brings along this other trait that has no particular adaptive value. And this happens all the time. So exclusively selectionist stories are, I think, truly dubious. This aside, any appeal to evolutionary selection pressures here is going to require that the consciousness of mental states has some adaptive advantage, that is to say, some utility, and I'm going to argue against that. I think that if you like naturalism, if you like naturalism, I think my higher order thought theory helps, along with the homomorphism theory that I very briefly sketched yesterday for mental qualities. And the reason that it helps is if you distinguish conscious states from non-conscious states, the non-conscious mental states are pretty easy to naturalize. They don't seem intuitively difficult to naturalize. And so if you can build up, as my theory does, conscious states from non-conscious states, then you're pretty much on the road to naturalization. And, as I've argued elsewhere, the higher-order thought theory points to an alternative, I think less questionable explanation of how mental states do come to be conscious, alternative to anything like adaptive value. Okay, so much for the preliminaries. Let's get down to the specific argument. I'm going to be quoting a mixture here of people in philosophy and people in psychology, but we'll start off with Sidney Shoemaker, who wrote in 1996 that adjusting first-order beliefs and desires to make them more rational requires, Shoemaker urged, that one have second-order beliefs about what one's current beliefs and desires are. First-order beliefs and desires, to quote Shoemaker, do not rationalize changes in themselves. So if you have a first-order belief or a first-order desire, and it would be good for you to somehow adjust those, that belief or that desire, right? Shoemaker thinks you need to have some higher-order belief or higher-order desire. In fairness to Shoemaker, Shoemaker doesn't think that these second-order beliefs have the effect that I think that they have of making anything conscious, but let's just put that aside, right? And David Armstrong, in his originally 1968 book, A Materialist Theory of the Mind, in second edition in 1993, wrote of what he somewhat grandly called a teleological deduction, which is that some mental states have to be conscious, right? The teleological deduction is to the effect that some mental states have to be conscious. And that's because any animal that solves problems mentally, which is very good for the animal, is going to have to be aware of some of its relevant mental states, right? According to Armstrong. And Armstrong, unlike Shoemaker, is a higher-order thought theorist, higher-order perception, in a sense. Now, some theorists actually build a tie between consciousness and rationality into the very account of what it is for a mental state to be a conscious state. And Ned Block does this with his notion of access consciousness. He writes that a state is access conscious if its content is poised for use as a premise in reasoning and for the rational control of action and speech. And I've emphasized the words that highlight rationality and reasoning in order to stress that for access consciousness, in effect, it's the kind of consciousness that figures in rationality. The state is going to be access conscious if, but only if, it has the potential to figure in rational thought and rational action. The idea that consciousness has some essential tie to rationality also inspires, I think, the well-known global workspace theories of consciousness, which I didn't talk about at all yesterday, on which a state is conscious just in case it has global ties to many cognitive states, ties that subserve the rationality of one's thoughts and desires. And Block has very explicitly noted the connection between global workspace theory on the one hand and his notion of access consciousness on the other. In addition to these considerations, introspection of self may seem to support a tie between consciousness and rationality, since we are introspectively aware of our own rationality only when the relevant thinking is conscious. That's sort of a trivial thing. If the relevant thinking isn't conscious, you can't be introspectively aware of the thinking, and so you can't be aware of its being rational. And the same kind of consideration is going to be relevant to my part 2 talk about intentional action, the connection between consciousness and intentional action, since the consciousness of an intention results in our being aware in a first-person way of the action as being intentional, as resulting from an intention. But since introspection isn't really going to do any good here, introspection has access only to conscious states. Introspection automatically has no access at all to mental states that are not conscious. Right? If a mental state is not conscious, you don't introspect it. Right? So, because of that, introspection cannot reveal a connection that conscious states have with rationality or intentional action, which non-conscious states lack. Introspection, in other words, can't tell you the difference, can't compare conscious with non-conscious states, because introspection only has access to the conscious ones. So it can't tell you that something's going on with conscious states that isn't going on with non-conscious states. All it can do is tell you what's going on with conscious states, and introspection might be right, of course, introspection might be wrong. There's in general no very good reason to take introspection's word for this kind of thing. But whatever it does, it's not going to be able to do the job claimed for it here. And there are various folk observations that suggest that consciousness actually adds very little functionality. So, thinking is often rational without that thinking being conscious, and behavior is often rational, that is, rationally key to the individual's goals, even when none of the thoughts and desires that the behavior results from are conscious thoughts and desires. So we sometimes solve problems and work out plans rationally, but not consciously. So we're trying to figure out what the solution to a problem is, or trying to figure out what the best way to make plans for something is, and at some point it may just come to us. That's the best way. All right? And there must have been some rational thinking that led to that conclusion, but since it just suddenly seemed to come to us, the rational thinking must have been not conscious. And we may even typically have a first-person sense that behavior is rational. Even when we correct or adjust our reasoning, and this point foreshadows Section 4 about executive control, even when we correct or adjust our reasoning, conscious monitoring of the reasoning itself seldom figures. Most often, it simply seems that we come to see things more clearly. So it's relatively unusual that we adjust our reasoning by consciously rehearsing the steps. And when we do that, it's typically awkward and slow. It's not the most functional way of getting the job done. We might, make a list, pros, cons, various other things. But that's awkward and slow. Typically, we don't have to do that. And it's not always the case that when we do things that way, it works out best. There's confirmation of these common sense folk observations in relatively recent findings by the Dutch psychologist Up Dijksterhuis and his colleagues. John Barr, formerly at NYU, now at Yale, has also contributed to this literature. But Dijksterhuis is, I think, the most dramatic. And they've shown that deliberating about complex consumer choices, what kind of refrigerator or automobile to buy, and they've done this both in the lab setting and in so-called real life, that complex consumer choices turn out to be better when the deliberating is not conscious. Better when the when it is. Now, Armstrong, more around this teleological argument that I quoted at the beginning of the section, Armstrong argues that if our mind is to work purposefully, we must have awareness of our minds. He continues, only by being aware of our current mental state can we adjust mental behavior to mental circumstance. Only if we do become so aware will we know what to do, that is, what to think, next. And that just seems to be not the case. It does reflect the perceptual picture of consciousness that Armstrong has. It's a perceptual picture in which, if you wanted to negotiate your way around a room, it would be a very good thing to look and see what's there, right? So if you want to negotiate your way through your mental states, it's a very good thing to kind of look at the mental states and negotiate your way through. And that's a very inviting picture, I suppose, in a metaphorical way. But we seldom, if ever, actually do anything at all like that. Our mental processing typically relies solely on causal interactions among the first-order states themselves. All of these sort of folk theoretical considerations that I've been rehearsing point to an important theoretical reason to expect that thinking and planning would often be rational, indeed that they would typically be rational, wholly independent of being conscious. The rationality of thoughts and desires is, of course, solely a matter of the connections that hold among the intentional contents of those states. If you've got a bunch of thoughts and desires, the only thing that matters about whether those thoughts and desires are rational is the intentional contents of the states. Nothing else figures in whether thinking and planning are rational. And intentional states, such as thoughts and desires, interact causally in ways that reflect their intentional content. And this pretty much has to be the case. Consider an animal that has thoughts and desires, and the thoughts and desires have intentional content, but the intentional content is completely independent from the causal potential of the thoughts and desires. So then the animal isn't going to act in any way that's appropriate to the intentional content of the thoughts and desires. So pretty much every theory of intentional content claims that in some way or other, forget that for a moment, every theory of intentional content claims that in some way or another there's a tracking relationship between intentional content of thoughts and desires on the one hand and the causal potential of the thoughts and desires on the other hand. Every theory claims that. And some theories, though not by any means all theories of intentional content, claim that a state's content is at least partly a matter of those causal connections. That's a stronger version, right? But all we need is the weaker thing, which is that there's a tracking connection between them. So a state will have the content that is raining, for example, only if that state has suitable causal connections, actual and potential. It doesn't actually have to cause things, but it has to have the potential to do so, with other relevant thoughts and desires. So given this tie between content and causal potential, thoughts and desires are going to tend to cause and to be caused by other thoughts and desires with which they have rational ties, since the causal ties will themselves be those that work for the animal, right? So you're an animal, you want to get something done, you want to live a good and happy life, right? You have beliefs and desires. The beliefs and desires have intentional content and also causal potential, right? Are the connections among the intentional contents of those states going to be rational? Of course they will be, because the intentional content, being rational, ensures that the causal potential is going to work for you, right? So rationality more or less comes along with the connection between intentional content and causal potential. And this is going to be independent of whether the thoughts and desires are conscious. Nothing so far about consciousness. This is just intentional content. Nothing about consciousness. And indeed, even when thinking is conscious, its being conscious is going to contribute little, if anything, to the thinking's being rational. Because rationality depends not on being conscious, rationality depends on intentional content and consequently causal potential. Very much the same kind of point emerges from noting, well, maybe actually, in the interest of time, that kind of repeats some things. Let's see. So I started at about 1. So here's an interesting argument that was put forth to me a little over a year ago. One can report a state non-inferentially only if that state is conscious. And so perhaps the ability to report is a function of consciousness. Maybe it's a good thing to be able to tell other people what mental state you're in. And you can only do that if the state is conscious, or at least that's the best way. No. Reporting one's thought or intention has very, very little function or utility that you can't have just by expressing the state. So, supposing you say, what's the weather like? And I say, very hot. Don't put on your coat. Very hot, don't put on your coat is the thing that has function. Telling you, I think it's very hot. I think you shouldn't put on your coat doesn't add anything. So the thing to bear in mind is, with any, we're just talking about intentional states here. We're not talking about qualitative states. That's a different story. Right? With any intentional state, if you can report it, you can also express it in speech. So there's no added function to reporting it that you can't get by just expressing it. And, you can try to think, what's a counterexample to that? Now, rationality is, of course, typically a matter of having reasons for something. Reasons to think something, reasons to do something, whatever. If I have no reason to think something, then thinking that thing fails in that particular way to be rational. And a reason is some thought or belief that one has, or one could have, that rationalizes another thought or desire. As argued famously by Donald Davidson in a marvelous paper in 1963. And it's going to be, the thought or belief is going to be my reason if I have the thought or belief, and it's just a reason if it's merely a thought or belief that I could have. Right? But a thought can be a reason, that is to say, one can have that thought or belief and it can rationalize other states or processes without the thoughts being conscious. A thought or a belief figures as a reason whether or not it's conscious. It figures as a reason because of its intentional content, not because of its consciousness. Okay, section 3, intentional action. The considerations that I've been talking about apply pretty much to the tie that's often claimed to hold between consciousness and intentional actions. That is, actions that stem from an individual's own prior volitions. The potential that volitions have to cause an action, to issue in an action, tracks the content of the volition. Whoops, sorry. So it's a matter of whatever causal potential goes with that content And that's, again, going to be independent of whether those volitions are conscious or not conscious. Again, the take-home message, the functionality, the utility is a matter of the intentional content, independent of consciousness. So volitions, like other mental states, need not be conscious. An action is going to be intentional if that action is initiated by a volition and is in that specific way under the individual's control. And it doesn't matter for that whether the volition itself is conscious. Acting intentionally, I think, does require that one perceive one's environment. At least typically, in many cases, not all. But the volitions themselves need not be conscious, and so far as that goes, the perceiving itself might be subliminal and therefore not conscious. All that to one side, even when intentions are conscious, their being conscious may play no role in the producing of actions. This is very important, so I'm going to read it again. Even when intentions are conscious, their being conscious may have nothing to do with the producing of actions. And this is actually shown, I think, by well-known experimental work by Benjamin Libet, which has been replicated and refined in important ways by Patrick Haggard, and recently by Soon et al. This is work that echoes the German psychologists Kornhuber and Deke, and is very widely discussed. And these results show that when subjects consciously decide to perform a simple action, like the pressing of a button or something of that sort, the neural event, the readiness potential, that initiates the action occurs prior to any conscious volition. So, there's the button press. Prior to the button press, there's a conscious volition. And prior to the conscious volition, there's a neural event that actually initiates the button press. So, if the conscious volition is coming after the neural event that initiates the button press, then the conscious volition is going to be all very nice and all that, but it isn't going to be doing any work in getting you to press the button. And the best interpretation of these results requires, I think, distinguishing a volition on its own from the volitions being conscious. So subjects are conscious of volitions only after the relevant readiness potential. So we can identify the readiness potential that occurs earlier with the volition. However, it's the volition in a non-conscious condition, because the subject isn't conscious of the volition yet. And we can see the Libet-Haggard-Soon results as indicating a lag between the initial onset of the volition itself and that volition's becoming conscious. And it's likely this holds for all intentional states, though when I've talked to serious neuro people, they assure me that volitions are pretty easy to test in this way, and intentional states that do not have to do with the initiation of behavior are very difficult to test. So to my knowledge, nobody has done that. Nobody's even tried yet to do it, but in the fullness of time. And if this is true, then thoughts in rational thinking and executive function would also occur prior to, and hence independently of, their being conscious. Now these results show that volitions cause behavior without those volitions being conscious. So, what must be happening is that both behavior and the consciousness of the volition are jointly caused by the volition before the volition becomes conscious. So you have the volition not being conscious, and it causes two things. It causes the behavior, and it causes itself to be conscious. My higher thought theory is a theory about how it causes itself to be conscious, but it doesn't matter whether that theory is correct. This is completely independent of that theory. So even though there may be types of behavior that occur, either in humans or even in general, only when the relevant volitions and desires are conscious, that does not show that the consciousness of the volitions has any role at all in producing those behaviors. This is important. I'm going to read it again. It might be that sometimes, for humans or other kinds of animals, it turns out that you never have a volition causing an action except when the volition is conscious. But that has nothing to do with consciousness being efficacious in causing the volition, because we have strong evidence that volitions cause behavior independently of their being conscious. So even if in some kinds of cases volitions always come to be conscious, that doesn't mean that their coming to be conscious has any efficacy or even enhances the causing of the action. These conclusions shed light. Maybe I'll skip that. If people are interested in Dan Wagner, we can take that up later. Maybe I'll skip that. If people are interested in height and green, we can take that up later. I mean, the things that I'm skipping are not essential to the argument. They're kind of applications of the argument. And I think they're nice, but there are a lot of nice things that we can do today. Okay. So, Larry Jacoby, a psychologist at Washington University in St. Louis now, has developed what's known to psychologists as the exclusion test. And this exclusion test is sometimes held to support a connection between consciousness and intentional action. One reason that it's sometimes held to support this connection is that Larry thinks it supports it, but there are other people too. So this is the way it goes. Subjects are visually presented with a word, for example, reason, and they're asked to complete a word stem, say REA, with any word that is not the presented word. So if you complete REA to turn out to be reason, then you're not doing what you're asked to do and you fail the exclusion test. If you complete it to the word read, then you're following the instructions correctly. Now, when the word is presented, roughly speaking, there are different conditions, but one contrast is that you present the word to the subject sometimes for a half a second, 500 milliseconds, and subjects see the word consciously. And they mainly succeed in following the instructions. So you present them with reason for half a second, they see it consciously, and they complete the stem with some other word. When it's only presented for 50 milliseconds, they say that they don't see any word at all, but they tend to complete the stem with the presented word. That is to say, they tend to complete they tend to complete it, in this case, with reason, and that's not following the instructions in the exclusion test. So the conclusion is supposed to be that subjects intentionally exclude the word only when they consciously see the word. But that's arguably, and that's of course true. That's what the result is, right? But arguably that is not because intentional action requires consciousness or, for that matter, has any connection with consciousness. It's a sort of special artifact of the exclusion test. Subjects are instructed not to complete the stem with a word that they see. And when they don't see the word consciously, they aren't conscious of seeing it, so they think they don't see it. So they're doing just what you asked. They think they don't see it. They complete it with reason. Why do they complete it with reason? Well, because the word that they think they don't see is actually functioning mentally to prime for behavior. So it's not that consciousness is needed for intentional action. Rather, in the subliminal 50 millisecond case, subjects following the instructions think that they don't see the word. They think they're following the instructions. Now, a few more general remarks. If you rely a lot on phenomenological appearances, then that's going to encourage assimilating thoughts and volitions, which are the states that we've been talking about so far, to our consciousness of those states. And since thoughts and volitions do have functionality, our consciousness of those states would then as well. So you're kind of running together two things. You're running together the thoughts and volitions themselves with our being conscious of them. But the Libet-Haggart-Soon findings, among many other psychological results, I think, show that these two are distinct. Maybe I'll forget this. Skip this. Okay, section 4. We're actually doing pretty well. So the Libet-Haggart findings, which show that a state's being conscious occurs later than, and for that reason, independently of, the state itself, provide evidence for an increasingly prevalent type of theory about what it is for a mental state to be a conscious state. These are the so-called higher order theories, of which mine is one version. And on these theories in general, a state's being conscious consists in one's being conscious of that state in some suitable way. And that's just the transitivity principle from yesterday's talk. And I argued yesterday, and I still think today, that the core idea is compelling because a state of which one is in no way at all conscious does not intuitively count as a conscious state. Now, higher-order theories all endorse the transitivity principle, though different higher-order theories have different views about how the transitivity principle is actually implemented in our psychological lives. And I've argued elsewhere that the transitivity principle is implemented best by distinct higher-order thoughts about one's own mental states, thoughts to the effect that one is in the state in question. And this turns out to fit well with the foregoing results. States occur independently of the higher-order thoughts of which they are conscious, and we can then explain volitions coming to be conscious after they first occur, because their being conscious is due to a distinct higher-order thought, which occurs very slightly after the volition it's about, and we can assume that in the standard case, the volition itself causes a higher thought about it, and so it's natural that the volition is going to come first, and the higher thought about it is going to come a moment later. Similarly, the Jacobi exclusion test subjects exclude only words they consciously see, because it's only those words that they think that they have seen. If subjects had a thought to the effect, I have seen that word, then the seeing would be conscious, which in the subliminal 50 millisecond case, it's not. The transitivity principle predicts the well-known tie between the state's being conscious and that state's being reported. Since one can report something if, but only if, one is conscious of that thing. Moreover, the reportability test that's very widely used in psychological, experimental psychological work, and is, I think, commonplace in folk thinking about consciousness. The reportability test for a state's being conscious points to distinct higher-order thoughts as the way in which the transitivity principle is implemented. And that's because reporting a mental state expresses a thought that one is in that state. If I say, I am in this state, I'm expressing my thought that I am in that state. So simply being able to report a state signals the occurrence of the higher order thought that one would express if one did actually report that state. And for those who are interested in blindsight, if you look at Larry Weisskranz's 1997 book, Consciousness Lost and Found, it's essentially this very consideration that he's using in developing the experimental methodology that he reports in that book. Executive function is the adjusting and fine-tuning of one's behavior, and hence the adjusting of one's first-order volitions. And because of that, executive function is often associated with higher-order processing. But such adjusting is often just a matter of ironing out conflicts among competing or dissonant first-order beliefs and desires. And you can do that simply on the basis of causal interactions among the first-order states. You don't need any higher-order states to iron out conflicts among competing and dissonant first-order states. Thoughts and desires all have causal ties with other first-order states, and those ties track content and we can expect that the states that have stronger ties are going to push aside states that have weaker ties. Moreover, even if higher order states do sometimes occur in executive processing, they may not be the right kinds of higher order states to result in first order states being conscious. The states being conscious requires a very specific kind of higher order state. It requires a higher order state in virtue of which one will be conscious of oneself as being in that state. And the higher order states that may sometimes occur in executive processing need not have that kind of content. Executive processing might just the states that occur in executive processing might just register conflict among particular first-order states and even indicate possible adjustments without thereby representing oneself as being in the state. So the higher-order states in executive processing could simply be about the states and need not have the content, I am in the state. And so they wouldn't result in the states being conscious. Okay, Edmund Rolls. It's often noted that learning to play tennis or learning to play a musical instrument, any of these kinds of things, initially involves the careful, attentive, deliberate rehearsing of specific actions that later come to be executed in a routine way and without deliberate attention. And some have concluded from this that since the earlier non-automatic actions must be deliberately and attentively executed, that the volitions that lie behind those earlier actions must be conscious intentions. And it's sometimes held that deliberate attentive actions involve executive control, whereas routine actions don't. I suppose Tim Challis is the most important person who's pushed this view in several papers that he's co-authored with Don Norman, Tony Jack, and some others. But deliberate intending need not be conscious. Deliberate intending is simply intending that results from deliberation. And deliberation itself need not be conscious. And attending itself is independent of consciousness. There's increasing literature on this. The last guy has just published another article on this, but since they're both 2009 And even if the intentive deliberation characteristic of non-routine actions, right, that is to say, so you're learning how to play tennis or play the piano or something like that, and you start out by very deliberately attending to your finger movements or your stroke or whatever it is. Even if those early non-routine actions, which have attentive deliberation behind them, right? Even if the attentive deliberation typically is conscious, it may very well be, as I've already noted in section 2, that being conscious doesn't add anything. It's just a byproduct of the deliberate attending, right? So the deliberate attending is the thing that has the efficacy, right? It's not the consciousness. If anybody's interested in Dresky, we can talk about Dresky in discussion. A methodological point. In effect, I've already said this, but I want to say it again because it's worth stressing. Higher order thoughts figured in my argument in section 4, in the stuff that I've been talking about with executive control, only in undermining the claim that's sometimes made that executive processing, executive function, has some beneficial tie with consciousness because both consciousness and executive function have a connection with higher order states. Right? It wasn't that I was arguing from my higher order thought theory. Right? I was just trying to undermine the connection between consciousness and executive function. So the argument against such functionality is independent of my specific theory. My argument against functionality in previous sections does appeal to many considerations that I've also used in defending the higher order thought theory. Right? So there are a bunch of considerations. And in some previous papers, I've used those considerations to defend the higher order thought theory. And here I'm using many of the same considerations to defend the idea that there's no significant function of consciousness. But that's okay. I'm doing that independently. I'm not doing that as a package. Skip Dresky. Skip this. And now, I think, summary. The higher order states, in virtue of which intentional states are conscious, do little, if anything, to facilitate rational thinking, intentional action, executive function, or the correcting of chains of reasoning. Elsewhere, I've argued that we can, independently of any such functionality and independently of evolutionary selection pressures, explain why those higher order states do very often occur.